There were moments when the weight of constant submission became heavier than the consequences of standing tall, when the mathematics of survival shifted to reveal that some dignities were worth protecting regardless of the price that defending them might exact from those who had learned to measure their worth according to other people's willingness to acknowledge their existence. For Niall Ashbrook, that moment of perfect clarity came on a Tuesday night, when exhaustion had stripped away every protective instinct, except the one that whispered that some lines could not be crossed, without abandoning essential pieces of character that defined who she was beneath the circumstances that had shaped her understanding of her place in hierarchies that demanded silence. 26 years old and bearing the quiet resilience that emerged from learning to navigate life without advantages that others took for granted, she possessed the kind of understated strength that came from understanding that survival often required absorbing casual cruelties without allowing them to destroy the core principles that made existence meaningful beyond simple endurance. But strength earned through systematic invisibility was often mistaken for weakness by those who had never been forced to discover what remained when everything else was stripped away by circumstances that tested character beyond its apparent breaking point. The Moonrise Diner existed at the intersection of several territorial boundaries, positioned where packlands met unclaimed wilderness in arrangements that made it useful for travelers who needed neutral ground for meetings that couldn't occur within territories governed by competing loyalties and political calculations. The building itself was unremarkable. Worn vinyl seats patched with duct tape, fluorescent lighting that flickered with electrical problems no one could afford to repair properly, coffee that stayed fresh because turnover was high enough to prevent staleness from becoming noticeable to customers whose standards were shaped by necessity rather than preference. But for all its modest appearance, the diner served important functions that extended beyond providing food and shelter to those whose journeys took them through regions where options were limited by geography and territorial politics. It was neutral territory where conflicts could be temporarily set aside, common ground where different packs could interact without the complications that arose from formal diplomatic protocols, sanctuary where individuals whose circumstances had placed them beyond traditional social protection could find temporary refuge from systems that had failed to accommodate their needs or acknowledge they. Arworth. Niall had been working there for 3 years, ever since circumstances had forced her to leave the pack that had raised her following disputes, that had revealed her presence to be more problematic than beneficial for community harmony and political stability. The transition from pack member to independent Omega had been challenging in ways that extended far beyond simple economic considerations, requiring adaptation to isolation that challenged fundamental assumptions about belonging and security that had shaped her understanding of how survival operated when protective systems were no longer available. The late shift suited her temperament and circumstances, providing work during hours when most pack members were settled in their own territories, while the travelers who passed through after midnight tended to be focused on reaching their destinations, rather than engaging in social interactions that might reveal information about backgrounds or circumstances that had led to journeys through board. Our regions where questions were discouraged and anonymity was respected, but neutrality was fragile, and the diner's location made it attractive to those whose power exceeded the careful balances that allowed such spaces to exist. Occasionally, visitors arrived whose authority operated beyond territorial limitations, whose presence transformed neutral ground into extension of their own domains, according to principles that recognized no appeal to local customs or established agreements about appropriate behavior in spaces designated for common use. Tonight would test whether the quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of systematic marginalization was strong enough to survive direct confrontation with power that acknowledged no limitations on its exercise, authority that expected submission not as courtesy but as natural right, that couldn't be questioned without challenging fundamental assumptions about hierarchy and appropriate recognition of superior status. The fluorescent lights hummed with electrical irregularities that created patterns of shadow and illumination across empty tables that awaited customers who might never arrive, while the coffee pot gurgled with sounds that marked time in spaces where events occurred according to unpredictable schedules rather than normal routine. Outside, wind moved through trees that bordered territories, where different rules governed behavior, and different standards defined appropriate treatment of those who lacked protection, or political connections that might serve as buffer against casual cruelties disguised as natural order. She had learned to read the signs that preceded difficult customers, engine sounds that spoke of expensive vehicles approaching neutral territory, with expectation rather than respect, voices that carried across parking areas, with tones that suggested entitlement to service that exceeded normal commercial relationships, presence that transformed shared spaces into extensions of personal domains, and where their preferences determined acceptable behavior from those whose circumstances required them to provide hospitality, regardless of treatment they received in return. But reading signs was different from being prepared for what they heralded, and some arrivals carried weight that challenged every assumption about power and its relationship to courtesy, authority, and its connection to respect for those who served essential functions while lacking protection that might limit how such service could be demanded or acknowledged. Tonight, she would discover whether the voice that had been carefully modulated for 3 years to avoid attracting attention possessed strength sufficient for moments when silence became complicity in treatment that violated principles more fundamental than personal safety or economic security. The diner waited in fluorescent quietude, neutral territory that was about to be tested by forces that recognize no boundaries except those imposed by power greater than their own. Sanctuary that would either preserve its essential character through recognition of shared humanity or reveal itself as illusion that lasted only as long as no one with sufficient authority chose to demonstrate that neutrality existed at the sufferance of those whose dominance could reshape reality according to their convenience and preference. Some lines, once crossed, changed everything that came after. Tonight would determine whether the quiet Omega who had learned to make herself invisible possessed courage sufficient for standing tall when circumstances demanded that someone speak truth to power, regardless of consequences that such honesty might exact from those who dared to claim space in hierarchies that had been designed to exclude them from recognition or respect. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The rumble of expensive engines cut through the late-night silence like thunder, announcing an approaching storm. Multiple vehicles arriving in formation that spoke of wealth and authority, rather than casual travel through border territories where most visitors appeared individually, or in small groups that reflected personal journeys, rather than official processions. Nielle paused in her routine of cleaning tables that had been empty for the past 2 hours, her enhanced hearing picking up sounds that suggested complexity beyond normal customer arrival patterns. Through the diner's front windows, headlights swept across the parking area with coordination that indicated professional drivers rather than ordinary travelers, while the vehicles themselves, sleek sedans that gleamed despite dust from rural roads, announced occupants whose circumstances exceeded anything the Moonrise Diner typically accommodated during late-shift operations. The first figure to emerge from the lead vehicle commanded immediate attention through presence that radiated authority before his identity became visible. Tall and powerfully built, with movements that spoke of absolute confidence in his security and status within hierarchies that governed their world, according to principles that placed him far above concerns about local customs or neutral terrain protocols. Even without formal identification, Nielle recognized Prince Adrian Blackthorn, heir to the Lycan king's throne and ultimate authority throughout territories that spanned continents. His reputation had preceded him through stories that emphasized both his capabilities and his attitudes toward those whose social positions placed them beneath notice from royalty, whose responsibilities supposedly transcended individual circumstances to encompass kingdom-wide concerns that affected millions of lives. Behind him followed members of what appeared to be royal entourage, advisors and guards, whose own presence commanded respect from anyone wise enough to recognize the kind of power that surrounded those who served ultimate authority, while their formation suggested security arrangements that reflected threats and responsibilities far beyond anything the diner's rural location would normally encounter. The bell above the entrance door chimed with sound that seemed inadequate for announcing arrival of such significance, while the fluorescent lighting that had been merely utilitarian moments before now felt harsh and unwelcoming for guests, whose usual environments probably featured illumination, designed to enhance rather than simply provide basic visibility for commercial transactions. Prince Adrian approached the counter with strides that covered ground efficiently, while his eyes swept the interior with assessment that took in details ranging from structural condition to cleanliness standards, to the lone staff member whose presence would determine the quality of service he could expect during whatever business had brought royal attention to neutral territory that existed at the Han. The margins of formal territorial control. Coffee, he commanded without preamble, his tone carrying expectation that orders would be fulfilled immediately, despite the late hour and minimal staffing that characterized operations designed for efficiency, rather than ceremonial service appropriate for royal preferences. "Certainly, Your Highness," Niel replied, with professional courtesy that attempted to balance acknowledgement of his status with maintenance of neutrality that governed interactions within spaces designated for common use, moving toward equipment that would provide what he had requested, despite awareness that her capabilities and resources fell short of standards he probably expected. But as she prepared coffee that met diner specifications rather than royal preferences, Prince Adrian's attention shifted toward details that apparently failed to meet his expectations about appropriate environment for someone of his status and authority. "This establishment appears to operate below acceptable standards for hygiene and service quality," he announced with volume that carried his assessment to entourage members who had arranged themselves around the diner's interior, typical of enterprises that serve clientele whose standards reflect limited resources and corresponding expectations. The casual dismissal of her workplace, and by extension her own circumstances, sent heat through Niela's chest, though she maintained neutral expression while continuing preparation that would satisfy his immediate requirements, regardless of her personal reaction to commentary that reduced her professional environment to inadequacy that apparently offended his sensibilities. "The facility serves its intended purpose," she replied carefully, keeping her voice steady, despite growing irritation at criticism that seemed designed more to demonstrate his superiority than to address genuine concerns about service quality or environmental conditions. "Does it?" Entrant, Prince Adrian's attention focused entirely on her with intensity that made several entourage members shift uncomfortably, as if they recognized dangerous territory being approached despite apparent insignificance of interaction between royalty and service personnel. "Then perhaps you could explain why service proceeds at pace that suggests either incompetence or deliberate disrespect for customers whose time carries value that exceeds your apparent understanding of appropriate priorities." The accusation struck her like physical blow, challenging not just her professional capabilities, but her fundamental worth as person whose existence apparently mattered less than his convenience, whose efforts to provide service were being evaluated according to standards that seemed designed to find fault regardless of actual performance. "Your Highness," she said with control that cost considerable effort to maintain, "I'm preparing your order as quickly as possible given available equipment and circumstances." Perhaps, he interrupted with tone that suggested her explanations were unwelcome intrusions on his authority to assess and criticize according to royal prerogatives that transcended employee rights to defend their performance. "You should focus less on making excuses, and more on providing service that justifies the inconvenience of accepting accommodation in facilities that fall significantly short of acceptable standards." Around the diner, his entourage members watched with expressions that ranged from discomfort to anticipation, some appearing to recognize that their prince was approaching territory where his behavior might reflect poorly on royal dignity, while others seemed to anticipate entertainment that would emerge from systematic demolition of someone whose circumstances provided no protection against very bowel assault disguised as legitimate customer feedback. The coffee had finished brewing during his critique, dark liquid that met basic requirements while falling short of luxury, that probably characterized his usual experience with beverage service. Niel poured it into standard diner cup that looked shabby compared to porcelain that undoubtedly graced royal tables, then moved to deliver what he had ordered despite growing certainty that nothing she provided would satisfy expectations that seemed designed to justify continued criticism. "Your coffee, Your Highness," she said with careful courtesy, placing the cup before him while maintaining enough distance to avoid accusations of inappropriate proximity while providing service that met basic requirements, despite environmental limitations. Prince Adrian lifted the cup with visible reluctance, as though proximity to common dishware might contaminate royal person through contact with materials that reflected her establishment's economic limitations. His initial taste produced expression that suggested exactly the kind of dissatisfaction she had anticipated, based on his previous commentary about acceptable standards and appropriate service quality. "Unacceptable," he declared with authority that transformed personal preference into objective assessment of failure that justified whatever criticism might follow. "This resembles coffee in appearance only, lacking any quality that would justify serving it to customers whose expectations extend beyond simple caffeine delivery." The systematic demolition of her efforts continued with professional precision that spoke of experience reducing service personnel to inadequacy through criticism that challenged their competence, while asserting his superiority through detailed catalog of deficiencies that reflected his elevated standards and refined sensibilities. Furthermore, he continued with momentum that suggested he was building toward crescendo of authority that would establish appropriate relationship between royalty and those whose circumstances required them to provide service regardless of treatment they received. The pace of service suggests either incompetence or deliberate disrespect that both reflect poorly on this establishment's understanding of appropriate customer relations. The accusation of deliberate disrespect crossed line that separated legitimate customer feedback from personal attack, challenging not just her professional performance, but her character and motivations in ways that violated principles of basic dignity that should have governed interactions regardless of power, differentials between participants. Something inside her snapped. "Stop barking," she said clearly, her voice cutting through royal criticism with authority that surprised even her, words emerging from reserves of strength she hadn't realized still existed after years of learning to absorb systematic dismissal without defending dignity that others apparently considered irrelevant to appropriate social dynamics. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Prince Adrian's mouth closed mid-syllable, his expression cycling through surprise, disbelief, and dawning rage as he processed being addressed with language that challenged his authority in front of witnesses whose opinions about royal dignity mattered for political reasons that extended far beyond this moment. His entourage members froze with expressions that reflected horror at witnessing interaction that violated every protocol about appropriate communication between royalty and commoners, while several moved instinctively toward positions that would allow intervention if circumstances escalated beyond verbal confrontation into territory that required physical protection of royal person. But most significantly, movement in the far booth caught her attention, as a figure she hadn't noticed during Prince Adrian's dramatic entrance slowly raised his head to focus attention on interaction that had suddenly become far more significant than routine customer service transaction. The Lycan King himself sat in shadows that had concealed his presence until her words had drawn his notice, golden eyes studying her face with interest that felt both dangerous and somehow approving, assessment that operated according to principles beyond her understanding, but carried weight that made every other consideration seem suddenly insignificant. The silence stretched between heartbeats, while forces she couldn't identify gathered around moment that had transformed neutral territory into battlefield, where questions about authority, respect, and appropriate treatment of those who served essential functions would be answered through outcomes that none of them had anticipated when the evening began. Prince Adrian's hand moved toward his belt, where ceremonial blade rested with weight of royal authority to punish those who dared challenge proper hierarchies, while his eyes burned with rage that suggested her words had crossed lines that demanded response, regardless of circumstances or venue that had witnessed such unprecedented disrespect. But before violence could resolve tensions that had been building toward inevitable confrontation, another voice spoke from shadows, where ultimate authority had been observing proceedings with interest that transcended casual entertainment to encompass assessment that would determine outcomes affecting far more than individual dignity or personal consequences. "Interesting," the Lycan King murmured, his voice carrying across the diner with tones that commanded absolute attention despite their quiet delivery. "Very interesting indeed." The weight of ultimate authority settled over the diner like velvet darkness that transformed every surface from ordinary commercial space into extension of royal court, where power operated according to principles that transcended local customs or neutral territory agreements. Prince Adrian's rage remained suspended in tableau, that reminded everyone present how quickly casual interactions could escalate into matters that affected far more than individual dignity or personal consequences for inappropriate behavior. King Lysander Blackthorn rose from shadows, where he had been observing proceedings with interest that had evolved from mild amusement to something approaching professional fascination, his movement commanding absolute attention, despite deliberate, unhurried pace that suggested confidence in his ability to control outcomes regardless of circumstances that had developed during his heir's interaction. "With service personnel, Adrian," he said quietly, the single word carrying authority that immediately redirected Prince Adrian's attention from Niall toward paternal disapproval that operated beyond simple correction to encompass evaluation of character and judgment that would influence future royal responsibilities and succession considerations. "Father," Prince Adrian replied through gritted teeth, his hand still resting near ceremonial blade, while his posture remained rigid with barely controlled fury at being challenged by someone whose circumstances should have prevented any response beyond grateful submission to whatever treatment he chose to provide. "Step away from the young woman," the Lycan king instructed with tone that made his words commands rather than suggestions, authority that brooked no argument, despite Prince Adrian's obvious reluctance to withdraw from confrontation that he probably viewed as necessary for maintaining appropriate respect and recognition of royal dignity. The heir's compliance was immediate, though clearly unwilling, his retreat creating physical distance while his glare promised that withdrawal did not represent acceptance of Niall's behavior, or forgiveness for words that had challenged fundamental assumptions about hierarchy and appropriate communication between royalty and those who served essential functions without possessing protection that might limit how such service could be demanded. "Now," King Lysander continued as his attention shifted fully toward Niall, with assessment that felt both dangerous and oddly respectful. "Perhaps you could explain what prompted such an extraordinary response to my son's entirely reasonable expectation of appropriate service quality." The question carried layers of complexity that challenged her understanding of safe responses, testing whether her moment of defiance had been aberration, driven by exhaustion, or reflection of character that operated according to principles deeper than immediate self-preservation. In situations where speaking truth to power carried obvious risks to personal safety and economic security, Niall found herself caught between competing instincts that had shaped her survival strategies during years of learning to navigate hierarchies that demanded submission while maintaining core dignity that defined who she was beneath circumstances that had reduced her social value to whatever others were willing to acknowledge about her worth and contributions. "Your Highness," she began carefully, though awareness of ultimate authority observing her words made calculation difficult when honesty might prove as dangerous as continued defiance, while diplomacy felt like betrayal of principles that had given her courage to speak initially. "The truth," King Lysander interrupted with emphasis that suggested he possessed methods for detecting deception that extended beyond normal conversation skills, rather than whatever politically careful response you believe might minimize consequences for behavior that has certainly attracted attention beyond anything you anticipated. The demand for honesty created impossible choice between authentic expression that might worsen her situation and protective dishonesty that would violate the very principles that had prompted her initial response to treatment, that had crossed lines defining basic respect for human dignity. "Your son entered neutral territory with expectation that his status entitled him to treatment beyond normal customer service," she said with steadiness that surprised her, discovering that speaking truth to ultimate authority felt less dangerous than compromising integrity that had sustained her through circumstances that had tested character beyond apparent breaking points. "He criticized my workplace, my capabilities, and my character based on standards that seemed designed to demonstrate superiority rather than address legitimate concerns about service quality or environmental conditions that reflect economic limitations rather than professional inadequacy or deliberate disrespect." The confession emerged with clarity that revealed thinking that had been developing throughout Prince Adrian's systematic demolition of her dignity, analysis that had identified patterns in his behavior that challenged assumptions about legitimate customer feedback versus abuse disguised as appropriate exercise of royal prerogatives. When criticism became personal attack that challenged my worth as person, rather than my performance as employee, she continued with momentum that carried her beyond safe territory into honesty that might prove costly, but felt necessary for maintaining principles more fundamental than immediate safety. I responded according to instincts that valued dignity over survival. King Lysander's expression revealed nothing, while his attention remained fixed on her face, with intensity that suggested he was processing information that extended beyond simple explanation of customer service dispute to encompass evaluation of character that operated according to standards deeper than immediate circumstances. "Dignity over survival," he repeated thoughtfully, as though testing how the words sounded when spoken aloud in context of interactions that had challenged fundamental assumptions about appropriate behavior between royalty and those whose circumstances required them to provide service regardless of treatment received. "Yes, Your Majesty," Niall confirmed with conviction that acknowledged potential consequences, while affirming principles that had proven stronger than protective instincts that had been developed through years of learning to absorb systematic dismissal without defending essential aspects of identity. Around them, Entourage members watched with expressions that reflected growing comprehension that routine customer service interaction had evolved into something approaching formal evaluation of character that might influence royal decisions, extending far beyond immediate consequences for inappropriate communication with heir to ultimate authority. "And you believe," the Lycan king continued with exploration that seemed designed to test depth of thinking that had produced such unprecedented response to royal criticism, "that dignity represents value sufficient to justify risking consequences that might include punishment for behavior that challenges established hierarchies and appropriate recognition of superior status." The question carried implications that extended beyond philosophical discussion to encompass practical assessment of judgment that had led someone in her circumstances to choose defiance over submission, when survival typically required accepting whatever treatment those with greater power chose to provide. "Your Majesty," she replied with recognition that honesty might seal her fate, while dishonesty would invalidate everything she had already risked. Dignity that can be surrendered for safety was never genuine dignity at all, but merely performance designed to secure temporary advantages through compromise of principles that define authentic worth. The words emerged from understanding that had been developing throughout her years of systematic marginalization. Recognition that survival strategies that required abandoning core identity ultimately defeated their own purposes by preserving existence while destroying everything that made such existence meaningful. "Interesting perspective," King Lysander murmured, with tone that suggested professional rather than personal interest in philosophical position that challenged practical wisdom, typically associated with those whose circumstances required prioritizing immediate safety over abstract principles that might prove costly to maintain. Prince Adrian's frustration with discussion that seemed to dignify, rather than punish behavior that he clearly viewed as unacceptable breach of proper protocol, finally exceeded his ability to remain silent during proceedings that should have been moving toward appropriate consequences for disrespect, rather than exploration of motivations that had prompted such unprecedented response. "Father," he interjected with barely controlled impatience, "surely the appropriate response to such behavior is correction, rather than philosophical discussion that appears to validate challenges to royal authority and proper recognition of our position within established social hierarchies." "Perhaps," the Lycan king replied, without shifting attention from Niall's face, "though I find myself curious about someone whose response to pressure reveals character that operates according to principles deeper than immediate self-preservation or social expectations about appropriate submission to superior authority." Mirti. The exchange between father and son revealed tensions that extended beyond immediate circumstances to encompass different approaches to royal responsibility and appropriate exercise of power that governed relationships between ultimate authority and those whose circumstances placed them beyond traditional protection or political consideration. "Your scent," King Lysander observed suddenly, his enhanced senses apparently detecting something that had required proximity to identify properly, "carries undertones that suggest background more complex than current circumstances would indicate. Bloodline that extends beyond typical Omega presentation." The observation sent shock through Niall's system as recognition dawned that her carefully maintained anonymity might be compromised by biological markers that she had assumed would remain undetectable among strangers who lacked intimate knowledge of her family history and genetic inheritance. "Suppressed heritage," he continued with certainty that spoke of experience identifying hidden bloodlines that had been concealed through necessity rather than choice, "suggests circumstances that forced abandonment of original identity in favor of survival strategies that required systematic self-diminishment to avoid recognition that might have proven dangerous." The accuracy of his assessment revealed knowledge that exceeded casual observation to encompass understanding of political dynamics that had shaped her circumstances, while his interests suggested that discovery of hidden heritage carried implications beyond simple curiosity about her background or family connections. "Which raises questions," the Lycan king concluded with attention that now felt both protective and predatory, about why someone with such bloodline finds herself working neutral territory establishments, rather than claiming position that her genetic inheritance should have provided within pack hierarchies that typically honor such heritage through appropriate recognition and social status. The diner had become stage where personal history was being revealed through methods that challenged every assumption about privacy and anonymity, that had allowed her to survive circumstances that had forced abandonment of identity in favor of protective invisibility that kept dangerous truths concealed from those who might use them against her. Behind ultimate authority's assessment, Prince Adrian watched with expression that revealed growing comprehension that routine customer service dispute had exposed complexities that extended far beyond inappropriate communication to encompass political considerations that might influence royal decisions about territories, bloodlines, and the hidden dynamics that shaped power relationships throughout their realm. The revelation that her scent carried markers of suppressed heritage had transformed neutral territory into extension of royal court, where questions about identity, authority, and appropriate recognition of worth would be answered according to principles that operated beyond local customs to encompass kingdom-wide implications for how power acknowledged or dismissed those whose circumstances had hidden their true value. The revelation about her bloodline hung in the air like smoke from ancient fires, transforming the conversation from simple customer service dispute into investigation that threatened to expose secrets that had been carefully guarded for over a decade. Niall felt the weight of ultimate authority's attention pressing against defenses that had been built through years of systematic self-concealment, protective strategies that were proving inadequate against royal expertise in reading genetic markers that revealed heritage despite deliberate efforts to obscure identity. Thornwick, King Lysander said with certainty that sent ice through her veins, the single word carrying implications that extended far beyond simple identification to encompass political consequences that had shaped her entire adult existence. Alpha bloodline from the northern reaches, eliminated during territorial disputes that officially concluded with peaceful resolution, but actually involved systematic removal of leadership that threatened established power arrangements. The accuracy of his identification revealed intelligence networks that extended beyond anything she had imagined possible, while his knowledge of events that had been carefully concealed through diplomatic fiction suggested that royal authority possessed information that challenged official accounts of conflicts that had supposedly been resolved through negotiation, rather than violence. Your family, he continued with tone that mixed professional interest with something approaching sympathy, represented obstacle to territorial consolidation that required their removal through methods that maintained plausible deniability while achieving political objectives that served broader strategic considerations. Prince Adrian's expression revealed growing comprehension that their interaction had exposed complexities extending far beyond inappropriate communication between royalty and service personnel, while entourage members shifted with discomfort that suggested recognition of territory where royal conversations ventured into matters that affected kingdom-wide policies and decisions that typically remained confidential. Which means, the Lycan King concluded with analysis that challenged every assumption about coincidence and chance encounters, that your presence here represents either remarkable survival against odds that should have prevented escape from systematic elimination, or indication that removal of your family was incomplete in ways that created ongoing political complications. Niall found herself caught between competing necessities that offered no safe responses. Acknowledgement would confirm identity that she had spent years concealing, while denial would insult ultimate authority's intelligence in ways that might prove even more dangerous than honesty about circumstances that had shaped her existence since childhood. Your Majesty, she said carefully, though awareness that concealment had already failed made diplomatic evasion seem futile, while outright lies would violate principles that had given her courage to speak truth initially. Circumstances required adaptations that prioritized survival over maintaining identity that had become liability, rather than advantage. Adaptations, he repeated with emphasis that suggested understanding of euphemisms that concealed trauma behind language designed to minimize emotional impact of experiences that had fundamentally altered her understanding of safety, belonging, and appropriate trust in systems that claimed to provide protection for those who needed assistance. The systematic elimination of your pack, Prince Adrian interjected with growing interest in revelations that challenged his understanding of territorial history and methods that had been used to achieve political stability during periods when diplomatic solutions had proven insufficient for resolving competing claims about authority and appropriate governance, was presented as internal collapse, following leadership failures rather than external intervention. Official accounts, his father replied, with tone that acknowledged gaps between public information and actual events that had shaped territorial boundaries through methods that required careful management of perception to maintain stability and prevent reactions that might destabilize broader political arrangements. often simplify complex situations to prevent widespread concern about policies that serve necessary strategic objectives. The casual acknowledgement of systematic deception that had concealed violence behind diplomatic fiction revealed approach to governance that prioritized political convenience over truth, while his matter-of-fact delivery suggested that such methods were considered normal tools for managing public opinion about decisions that affected individual lives according to broader calculations about kingdom-wide stability. However, King Lysander continued with attention that returned fully to Niall's face. Survival that required abandoning alpha heritage to assume omega identity suggests resourcefulness that extends beyond simple adaptability to encompass strategic thinking that most individuals would lack under circumstances that typically result in death rather than successful concealment. The observation carried weight of professional assessment that evaluated capabilities according to standards that measured worth through demonstrated results rather than inherited status, while his tone suggested that survival skills that had allowed her to maintain anonymity might represent qualities that served purposes beyond individual self-preservation. Which raises questions, he said with momentum that indicated development of thinking that had been building throughout their conversation, about appropriate utilization of abilities that have been systematically underutilized due to circumstances that forced concealment of heritage that should have provided opportunities for service that honored genetic potential. Around them, the diner's fluorescent lighting seemed inadequate for conversation that had evolved from customer service interaction into evaluation that might reshape her understanding of possibilities that extended beyond survival to encompass recognition that could restore identity that had been abandoned for protective anonymity. Your response to my son's behavior, the Lycan king observed with return to original incident that had triggered discoveries about heritage and capabilities that challenged assumptions about appropriate social positioning, suggests character that operates according to principles deeper than immediate self-preservation, qualities that might serve useful purposes if properly directed. Prince Adrian's expression revealed complex emotions as he processed implications of discoveries that transformed his target from insignificant service personnel into survivor of policies that had directly affected territorial boundaries and political arrangements that governed their kingdom, according to principles that prioritize stability over individual circumstances. "Father," he said with uncertainty that replaced earlier rage, though residual frustration remained visible in posture that reflected confusion about appropriate responses to someone whose circumstances had been revealed as far more complex than surface appearances had suggested. "If her heritage represents what you're implying, then her presence here suggests opportunity," the Lycan king interrupted with finality that indicated decisions were being made based on information that had emerged through conversation, that had exposed potential, that exceeded anything normal customer service interaction would have revealed about capabilities and character that operated beyond immediate circumstances. "Your skills in maintaining concealment," he said directly to Niall, with assessment that honored achievements that had required constant vigilance and strategic thinking to maintain safety through methods that most individuals would never have developed or implemented successfully, suggest abilities that could serve useful purposes if applied to challenges that require similar discretion and strategic thinking. The offer hung in fluorescent-lit air that had been transformed from neutral territory into extension of royal court, where decisions about recognition, opportunity, and appropriate utilization of hidden potential were being made based on discoveries that challenged assumptions about worth and social positioning according to inherited, rather than demonstrated capabilities. "Service," she repeated carefully, though growing comprehension suggested that royal attention had identified possibilities that extended far beyond her current circumstances, while carrying implications that might restore identity that had been abandoned for protective anonymity. "In what capacity, Your Majesty?" "Intelligence operations that require individuals capable of maintaining cover identities while gathering information that serves kingdom-wide security considerations," he replied with specificity that transformed vague possibility into concrete opportunity that would utilize survival skills developed through necessity for purposes that served broader objectives than personal advancement. "Positions that honor strategic thinking while providing recognition that acknowledges worth beyond surface appearances or social positioning that fails to reflect genuine capabilities and proven character under circumstances that test individual strength beyond normal parameters." The proposition represented transformation from systematic marginalization to meaningful service that would honor abilities while providing security that had been absent since circumstances had forced abandonment of heritage in favor of survival strategies that required constant vigilance and self-concealment. Prince Adrian watched with expression that revealed recognition of character that operated according to principles he had failed to acknowledge during initial interaction, while his posture suggested developing respect for someone whose response to pressure had revealed qualities that challenged his assumptions about appropriate behavior and legitimate authority. "Your decision," King Lysander concluded, with tone that acknowledged her right to determine outcomes that would affect every aspect of her existence. "Though I suspect that someone who chose dignity over safety when faced with inappropriate treatment might find purpose in service that honors such principles, while providing opportunities for meaningful contribution to objectives that extend beyond individual circumstances." Behind royal authority's offer, the diner's worn surfaces and fluorescent lighting reminded her of years spent in systematic invisibility, survival that had been achieved through careful management of identity that required constant vigilance to maintain safety from forces that had eliminated her family, according to political calculations that prioritized territorial control over individual lives. But the proposition also represented recognition that acknowledged worth beyond circumstances, opportunity that would restore identity while utilizing capabilities that had been developed through necessity for purposes that served broader objectives than simple survival or economic security that characterized her current existence. "Your Majesty," she said with steadiness that reflected decision-making processes that had been developing throughout conversation, that had challenged every assumption about possibilities and limitations that governed her understanding of appropriate responses to ultimate authority. "I accept your offer with gratitude for recognition that honors capabilities despite circumstances that have required their concealment." "Excellent," the Lycan King replied with satisfaction, that suggested outcomes that served multiple purposes had been achieved through conversation that had begun with customer service dispute and evolved into recruitment that would serve kingdom-wide security considerations while providing individual recognition that restored appropriate social positioning. Prince Adrian approached with expression that mixed lingering uncertainty with developing recognition of errors that had shaped initial interaction, his movement careful, while his posture suggested awareness that relationships had been fundamentally altered through discoveries that challenged assumptions about appropriate behavior between royalty and those whose heritage operated beyond surface appearances. "Your pardon," he said with formality that acknowledged both her revealed status and his inappropriate treatment that had failed to recognize worth that existed independent of immediate circumstances, for behavior that reflected poor judgment about character that deserved recognition rather than criticism. The apology carried weight of genuine acknowledgement that transformed their relationship from conflict to mutual respect, based on understanding that authority required wisdom rather than simple assertion of superior status, while recognition of her heritage provided context that explained responses that had seemed inappropriate until fuller truth was revealed. Outside the diner's windows, dawn was beginning to touch horizon with light that promised transformation of neutral territory back into ordinary commercial space, though consequences of conversation that had occurred during late-night hours would continue to shape outcomes that extended far beyond immediate circumstances to encompass recognition and opportunities that honored authentic worth regardless of protective strategies that had been required for survival. The Omega, who had learned to make herself invisible, was about to discover what became possible when capabilities were recognized by authority that served purposes greater than individual convenience, while the prince who had mistaken dignity for defiance would carry forward understanding that genuine authority honored character rather than demanding submission that violated essential principles about treatment of those who served functions that sustained the systems they all depended upon. Neutral territory had served its purpose, providing space where truth could emerge without territorial complications that might have prevented discoveries that served kingdom-wide objectives while honoring individual worth that had been systematically overlooked by circumstances that reduced evaluation to surface appearances rather than demonstrated character under conditions that tested strength. Beyond ordinary parameters, the transformation was complete, though its implications would continue to unfold through service that would honor heritage, while utilizing abilities that had been developed through necessity for purposes that transcended survival to encompass meaningful contribution to security, that protected those who might never know how their safety had been preserved, through recognition that operated beyond conventional assessment to honor authentic capabilities regardless of circumstances that had required their concealment. 8 months later, the intelligence briefing room within the royal palace represented convergence of authority and expertise, where kingdom-wide security decisions were made through analysis that operated beyond political convenience to encompass genuine threats and opportunities that affected millions of lives, according to principles that prioritized protection over immediate comfort or diplomacy. See appearances that concealed dangerous realities. Commander Niall Thornwick sat at polished conference table that reflected morning light streaming through windows designed to provide natural illumination, while maintaining security protocols that protected sensitive discussions from surveillance methods that might compromise operations requiring absolute discretion and strategic coordination among individuals whose capabilities served objective, as extending far beyond personal advancement or recognition. Her transformation from diner waitress to senior intelligence operative had challenged every assumption about rapid advancement and appropriate recognition of capabilities that had been systematically underutilized due to circumstances that had forced concealment of heritage through protective strategies that prioritized survival over authentic expression of genetic potential and strategic thinking abilities. The Northern Reaches operation has been concluded successfully, she reported to assembled leadership that included King Lysander, Prince Adrian, and department heads, whose responsibilities encompassed territorial security through methods that relied on accurate information, rather than diplomatic assumptions about regional stability and appropriate governance structures. Infiltration of separatist networks revealed connections to external influences that had been systematically destabilizing territorial boundaries through support for local conflicts that served broader strategic objectives rather than legitimate concerns about autonomous governance or cultural preservation that had been publicly cited as justification for resistance movements. The briefing summarized months of work that had required maintenance of cover identity, while gathering intelligence that exposed political manipulation disguised as grassroots opposition, operations that had tested abilities developed through years of concealment, while serving kingdom-wide security that protected populations from external threats they never knew existed. Prince Adrian's attention remained fixed on her presentation with respect that had developed through observation of professional capabilities that honored strategic thinking, while maintaining ethical principles that governed appropriate methods for achieving objectives that served protection rather than political dominance or territorial expansion through questionable means. Recommendations? King Lysander asked with tone that acknowledged expertise that had been proven through results rather than inherited status. Authority that honored demonstrated capabilities while maintaining ultimate responsibility for decisions that affected kingdom-wide policies and territorial relationships that required careful balance between security and diplomatic considerations. Continued monitoring of external networks while implementing economic development programs that address legitimate concerns about regional autonomy without compromising territorial integrity or security arrangements that protect populations from external manipulation disguised as support for cultural independence, she replied with analysis that balanced practical necessities with recognition of authentic grievances that required address through constructive rather than purely security-focused responses. The comprehensive approach reflected thinking that extended beyond immediate threat elimination to encompass sustainable solutions that served long-term stability through methods that honored both security necessities and legitimate concerns about governance that affected individual communities, according to principles that prioritized well-being over political convenience. Approved, the Lycan king concluded with satisfaction, that indicated confidence in recommendations that served multiple objectives through strategies that honored both security requirements and ethical considerations about appropriate treatment of populations whose circumstances had made them vulnerable to external manipulation. As the briefing concluded, and officials departed to implement decisions that would affect territorial relationships according to principles that balanced protection with respect for legitimate autonomy, Prince Adrian approached with expression that mixed professional admiration with something approaching personal interest that had been developing throughout months of observing capabilities that challenged assumptions about worth and appropriate recognition. Your analysis continues to demonstrate strategic thinking that exceeds anything our previous intelligence operations achieved, he said, with acknowledgement that honored professional achievements, while his tone carried undertones that suggested appreciation, extending beyond simple recognition of work performance to encompass personal qualities that had been revealed through service that honored P. Principles rather than demanding compromise of essential character. "Thank you, Your Highness," she replied with warmth that reflected relationship that had evolved from conflict through mutual respect to partnership that honored both professional capabilities and personal connection that had emerged through shared commitment to service that protected rather than dominated those whose circumstances required protection from forces beyond their individual capacity to resist. The formal address carried affection that transformed protocol into intimacy, while maintaining appropriate recognition of positions that served kingdom-wide objectives through methods that honored both authority and equality within relationships that transcended simple hierarchy to encompass genuine partnership based on demonstrated character and shared values about appropriate exercise of power. "The diner," Prince Adrian observed with tone that mixed curiosity with something approaching nostalgia for circumstances that had revealed truth about character through confrontation, that challenged assumptions about dignity and appropriate treatment of those whose circumstances concealed genuine worth. "Do you ever think about returning to visit neutral territory where our relationship began, though? Rough circumstances that neither of us anticipated." "Occasionally," she admitted with smile, that acknowledged transformation that had occurred through recognition that honored authentic worth rather than surface appearances. "Though I suspect that Maria has adjusted staffing patterns to accommodate late-night rushes of customers whose behavior might require intervention by someone with diplomatic training, rather than simple service industry expert." Iance. The humor carried recognition that their initial interaction had become legend among intelligence communities, where stories about recruitment methods served educational purposes about recognizing potential that operated beyond conventional assessment to honor character that emerged under pressure rather than comfort, that failed to test genuine capabilities. Speaking of diplomatic training, Prince Adrian continued with momentum that indicated development of conversation toward territory that transcended professional recognition to encompass personal considerations that had been building throughout months of partnership that honored both individual worth and shared commitment to service that protected rather than exploited those they served. "I find myself wondering whether your expertise in maintaining cover identities might extend to long-term arrangements that serve personal rather than purely operational objectives." The suggestion carried implications that transformed professional partnership into possibility of relationship that would honor both individual autonomy and shared commitment to principles that governed appropriate treatment of others, while serving objectives that transcended immediate circumstances to encompass lifetime dedication to protection and service that honored authentic worth. "Your Highness," she replied, with understanding that acknowledged both opportunity and responsibility that came with relationships that served multiple purposes, while honoring individual choice about commitments that would affect every aspect of existence. "Are you proposing arrangement that would combine personal partnership with continued professional service, according to principles that honor both individual autonomy and shared objectives?" "I am," he confirmed with certainty, that spoke of decision-making processes that had been developing throughout months of observing character that operated according to principles deeper than immediate advantage. Recognition that authentic partnership required equality, that transcended formal hierarchy, to honor mutual respect, and shared commitment to service that protected, rather than dominated. "Then," she said with joy, that reflected understanding that transformation from systematic marginalization to meaningful recognition had led to possibilities that exceeded anything she had imagined when circumstances had forced protective invisibility that concealed potential for decades. "I accept with gratitude for partnership that honors individual worth while serving objectives greater than personal comfort or conventional expectations about appropriate relationships." Outside the palace windows, territories stretched toward horizons that encompassed millions of lives, protected through intelligence operations that served security while honoring dignity. Populations whose safety depended on recognition that worth existed, independent of surface appearances or social positioning that failed to reflect genuine capabilities and authentic character. The Omega, who had defended dignity over survival, had discovered that courage, which honored principles rather than protective convenience, could transform systematic marginalization into meaningful service that protected others who faced circumstances that required advocacy from those whose circumstances had taught them that strength emerged through adversity rather than privilege. Prince Adrian had learned that genuine authority required recognition of worth that operated beyond inherited status to honor character, that emerged through testing rather than comfort, while their partnership would serve kingdom-wide objectives through methods that balanced security necessities with ethical principles about appropriate treatment of those whose circumstances required protection, rather than exploitation. The late-night confrontation in neutral territory had revealed truth about character that transcended immediate circumstances to expose potential that served purposes greater than individual advancement, while their relationship would honor both personal connection and professional commitment to service that protected rather than dominated those whose circumstances placed them beyond conventional protection. Their story had begun with moment, when exhaustion had stripped away protective strategies to reveal authentic character that chose dignity over safety, recognition that worth existed independent of circumstances that had been shaped by forces beyond individual control, but could be transformed through courage that honored principles deeper than immediate self-preservation. The transformation was complete, though its implications would continue to unfold through service that honored heritage, while protecting those who might never know how their security had been preserved, through partnership that balanced authority with equality, recognition that authentic power served protection rather than personal advancement through methods that honored character, rather than circumstances that had temporarily concealed genuine worth. In royal archives where their intelligence reports would be preserved for future generations, scholars would study methods that had exposed external threats through operations that honored ethical principles while achieving security objectives, learning that effectiveness required recognition of authentic capabilities regardless of surface appearances that concealed potential through protective strategies necessitated by circumstances beyond individual choice. But in private moments when duty allowed expression of personal connection that had emerged through professional partnership, they would remember neutral territory where courage had revealed truth about character that transcended hierarchy to honor mutual respect and shared commitment to service that protected rather than exploited those whose circumstances required advocacy from those who understood. That strength emerged through adversity rather than privilege or inherited advantage. The diner still served travelers who needed neutral ground for interactions that transcended territorial boundaries, though its reputation now included stories about recognition that could transform casual encounters into opportunities that honored authentic worth regardless of protective strategies that circumstances had required for survival and systems that failed to acknowledge potential that operated beyond conventional assessment. Some moments changed everything that followed, and theirs had begun with two words that challenged authority while honoring dignity. Stop barking. The echo of that courage would continue to resonate through service that protected millions who would never know that their security depended on recognition that worth existed, independent of circumstances, partnership that honored both individual autonomy and shared commitment to principles that served protection, rather than personal advancement through methods that balanced strength with wisdom. About appropriate exercise of power. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.